Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman religion, hence history, culture, and war, fundamentally, in the roots that we can identify in order to explain the cause of Roman greatness, of the rise of a historical force that objectively has not seen any equal, right, in the history of mankind, considering the context, the background, and that we will make lots of other videos about, explaining in a way, in fact, the cause of the rise, the spiritual principle that laid at the foundations of it, the Indo-European legacy that the Romans, the Latins were recollecting at that point, in inverting a process that at that point was not just the one of a broader decadence of the great Indo-European cycles in Europe, or their relative stagnation, especially in Central Europe. Mostly, when we made a video about the Hellenic civilization and this broader success, paralleled by the waning of the original sacral magic force, right, of the Achaean and the Dorian conquerors, and that in Rome takes on a very special meaning, not just because of the impact on world history, and as we have just said, as essentially the unmatched, unparalleled, unsurpassed meta-historical force fundamentally has molded history itself, and the world and the vision of the same, but also because of the background that was at that point essentially rolling backwards relatively to the such developments, or at least the maintenance of a certain traditional system of values that had been proper of the ancient Indo-European conquerors, right? And we could draw many parallelisms of whether, eventually the Roman legacy was recollected with the Holy Roman Empire, this kind of northern Teutonic attempt to revive the ancient Roman ideal, that, however, stands in a very different context of, that was in great part already secularized compared at least to the origins of Indo-European culture, and that we can trace because it's been documented by the Romans themselves. On Schwerpunkt, we already talked a bit about archaic Rome and the denied and occulted and somewhat forgotten Indo-European dimension, what this meant in parallel to basically any other Indo-European context, with parallelisms, of course, that we find also in non-Indo-European peoples that revolve around this cycles of of rise and fall in a way, but that the Romans highlighted quite clearly in their sagas, in the dichotomy between the Uranic, Apollonian dimension and the Tectonic, Dionysian one, if you want, that was proper at that point of the majority of the Mediterranean peoples, and that the Indo-Europeans had, subdued fundamentally at the moment of the conquest, but had, if anything, for demographic reasons, but also because of the fact they weren't hungry anymore, right? So diluted into, right, and so gradually abandoned and mixed their own their own values and moral systems with. In the case of Greece, we made a video a week ago. We've seen how in a way we're much better informed because of the early development of Hellenic civilization, and the greater continuity over time, right, between the Achaean, the Dorian phase of an important also material wealth that allowed us to reconstruct certain elements and to make maintaining Greece a sort of cultural resistance that, albeit in fact, providing us this evidence, shows very clearly the blend, the mix between the Uranic and Tectonic elements society. In Italy, this was in a sense similar, because the Italian peninsula was much more primitive in nature, also much more warlike, and yet the Indo-European migrations that occurred across, let's say, the 1000 BC, right, the centuries before, so later, is much less documented, and in a sense shows, even in here, right, a sort of adaptation of the conquerors to mostly the Pelasgian dimensions, the cult of the Mother Earth, right, so this preeminent kind of feminine, Demetrian, Aphrodisian, Dionysian dimension that was proper of the masses, but still, because of this martial spirit of the Italic peoples, had somewhat remained distinguished, in spite of the lack of some important superstructures, like at least compared to Greece, very distinguished in a spiritual sense, right? We find a bit like in the Veda in India, this conquering community that has at this point diluted in the Italian peninsula, but that maintains, spiritually speaking, culturally speaking, this important separation conceptually, right? So as a super historical idea at this point, because for the rest, ethnically speaking, they were blended like in any other area, but in the quite fertile and populated Italy, importantly so, but still maintained a sharp dimension, that is sharp separation, that is in fact exemplified by the Roman Sagas that are dramatically underestimated. And as we were saying before, what is more striking of Rome is this specific context, right? The idea that it was not obvious that this peninsula, at the fringe of the greater waves of Indo-European peoples, in spite of its wealth, would witness spiritually the rebirth, essentially, of the greatest universal rule, inspired to the celestial military glory, right, of the Indo-European background, would reemerge and eventually taking over literally the entire world on the base of the unmitigated and uncompromised base of such principle. That is best exemplified by, in fact, this Roman, the Roman culture at the deepest, in the deepest veins of its nature. And so it's important also to make a work of abstraction in this sense, in the absence of historical, strictly narrowly meant information, right? When we read the Roman Sagas, we're talking about something between history and myth, right? But nevertheless, that's quite revealing, because how these ideas were fabricated, and they surely derived from an ancient substratum, as much as the Indo-European, elite. This thing lived on, was recovered, and the Roman miracle was fundamentally built around such unspeakable moral drive. And again, this is all the more relevant if we consider the nature of the peoples that inhabited the Italian peninsula before the Roman conquest, right? So we're talking of peoples of different stock, mostly Italic, so the Sabellians, the Volscians, the Samnites, where you can call them Osco, Umbrians, whatever, plus the Etruscans, the ethnic origin of which we will comment briefly later, but also if we go further south, actually, in the southern coast, in Sicily and so on, the Phoenicians, the Siculians and Sicani, the Hellenic and Syriac immigrants, right, that by living in a bit of a different dimension, a more urbanized one, and fundamentally coastal one, were still present. At least the Siculians and the Sicani were in the interland, right? There is a debate whether they were Italics or not, right? So these waves of Indo-European conquerors, but in any case, at this point, they had surely come to dwell in a quite multicultural dimension. And we don't have to underestimate that for Rome itself, that had an important attractive capacity also for foreign elites at an important stage of its even at an early stage of its development, but that's another topic we'll not discuss today. So what is striking of the Roman conquest in this picture is that you see, you don't find really another force like it had been in the case of Indo-European conquests that came, I don't know, in Greece, but in the way we have seen in different waves, the Achaeans, the Dorians, probably actually lots of other, pockets in the between and before, etc. But fundamentally emerging from the city of Rome itself, that was an important center, but not quite. There was nothing deterministic about it, taking over as a power, which was not at the beginning. This thing, and what is more striking in this sense is that through the Roman Sagas we read the event, and we observe even later on in the conquest of Italy, it was documented also by external and much more rational and secularized observers such as the Greeks, of a sort of, first of all, the eruption of Roman power, but properly the break that such conquest represented with the Roman populations and their cults and views of law and claims of political supremacy, right? So there is a new principle that appears with the rise of Rome that is as fatal as unsettling in its absolute, fundamentally, that was able to not just to subjugate literally everything that found on its path, right? The Romans were completely incapable of conceiving the idea that they could have been ever stopped, or that even a setback would fundamentally identify some sort of definition of their own inferiority compared to another thing. The Romans would just systematically subdue. And not only, they would manage to transform deeply the customs and ways of lives of the subjugated populations, right? With an incredibly ferocious, violent, suppressive way, but at the same time, as we know, also an inclusive, and we're talking about cooptation of the elites mostly, but through this principle of essentially picking the morally superior and giving it the chance of working, right? So for duty, but also reward, right, for the conqueror that had at that point obtained the full right to dispose completely of any kind of of subjugated, as the universal moral standards were at that point. And we know how it ended. Inside, it was something incredible, because it was an unstopped phenomenon, right? That in a sense lives on today, still in our institutions, in our legacy. The symbols of Roman religion fundamentally are present in every single Western policy institution. Symbolism, strictly meant about properly the moral virtue, right, of rule. And this phenomenon cannot be explained, and unfortunately it's been done right in this way from a long time, in a sort of just essentially socio-economical way, right? Secondary causes, environmental, materialistic ones. We say, well, Rome was well placed, kind of, but it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't. Even if you just know Roman history or history in general, even just ancient history, that what through which struggles this thing passed. It was nothing, in fact, teleological about that, right? And we cannot but just stand in awe before the Roman miracle, and appearing just as inept and illiterate in the very moment in which we pretend that this had to happen rationally, or for some reason that can just be sorted out mathematically in the first place. So in some ways, yes, it is better to stand in awe rather than just trying to explain something through a secondary cause that doesn't quite fit the what we underestimate constantly, historically speaking, that is properly the mindset of the peoples that we are we're dealing with, so that these are not like mice in a laboratorium cage that just randomly do stuff, right? These are human beings that are literally molding the world at their own will and succeeding, right? And having an attitude towards towards reality and the deity and ecumenic power that is completely alien at this point from most anything that we can remotely conceive. And there is no doubt that from the Roman Sagas, the celestial, martial, virile element is at the roots, right, of this kind of expansion. In opposition to naturally Tectonic, feminine, nocturnal, Dionysian dimension. That is the great theme of all the Indo-European mythologies of the warlike peoples, of the steppes of the conquerors, right, that came to subjugate this agricultural world from the top of their horses, of their moral military superiority, and that in fact took over systems that were abnormally larger than them demographically, materially, and out of their sheer individual force, or at least a collective one, but still molded in a quite exclusivistic sense. There is no doubt in Rome, much more than, for example, the Hellenic sagas, that this was overly emphasized. And this is even more relevant because, as we will see, the feminine, maternal element would actually maintain a great importance in Rome as a substratum, right? The Romans would also work dramatically to, make of this, appurate in this model the Demetrian, agricultural, tonic, telluric dimension in a fatalistic, naturalistic sense, and to make of the woman, of course, the symbol, the model of all virtues. Think about the Roman Matronae and all, the deep meaning that lays at the roots, properly, of the warlike, right? That these were just, ideally, the Spartan women, these were women that had to breed warriors, and that is the underlying tone, which was dramatically different from the pre-Indo-European, say Pelagic, meaning Mediterranean peoples in this regard, right? And what is incredible about this is how neat this separation is, how unambiguous it is, how primitive it is too, right? In the Hellenic mythology, as we've seen in the previous videos, the generation, for example, of the gods somewhat betrays the prevalence of the Tectonic dimension on the longer run on the Indo-European superstratum that was absorbed here. The Romans that came from a similarly ethnic background actually never compromised in their renewal on this at any level. What is this the process of the Indo-European migrations in Italy so crucial for understanding the stages? Well, not really, because as we were saying before, unlike Greece and basically that's the only exception, we don't know much about Indo-European migrations in Europe in the first place. Like, they're not documented. If you think about even the Veda in India, there's literally nothing left archaeologically from that. It's just a cultural injection that we can trace religiously, philological, folklorically, anthropologically, all these things that survived until with this dramatic force that was able to properly to be handed down in spite of the material dimension, which was of the moral one. Of course, we know that prior to the Celtic migrations and the flourishing also, of the Etruscan culture, there were some northern, properly Indo-European populations that from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, appeared in Italy as conquerors and took over great part, the majority of the peninsula. And they, as we've seen, they naturally settled, and they naturally began to interact, to be absorbed by the local populations. It's just like it had happened by the Dorians and the Achaeans in Greece, right? And what is evident archaeologically, historically, from these migrations is that they definitely belonged to the culture of the reindeer and the battle axe, were typically northern populations that had swarmed into Eurasia during the same periods. And the Latins, right, as a branch of the Italic peoples, it's important not to say sometimes we will say the Italian peoples, meaning properly geographically speaking, the whole, maybe not today, we won't even need to deal with them, but meaning that like literally they were all different ethnic backgrounds, right? If we talk about the Italian peoples, we mean geographically the fact that Italy had, as we've seen, Italics, Celts, Etruscans, Greeks, and all these people, Illyrians even, and more. Ligurians, I mean, peoples that the same Etruscans, we don't know actually where they came from. That's another thing. But within the the Italic peoples, the Latins represented a very imposing branch that normally opposed to the that mostly dwelt in the Tyrrhenian dimension, right, in the lower Tiber Valley, and so Rome stood. And whereas the Apenninic, latitudinally developed band, let's say, was inhabited by the the Oscan peoples, fundamentally, the Samnites, the Umbrians, and so on, that had important intersections also with other peoples, as we were saying before. There were Illyrians coming from the other side of the Adriatic, the Celts in the north, then were the Etruscans, roughly, in Tuscany, in northern Italy, then, the north was Celticized, and so on. And Rome emerges from the Latin substratum that actually does show prepotently in this, we know through the Roman Sagas, but also through other elements, this original vein, or at least reemergence of the Indo-European, ethos, and even epos in their, for as much as it is documented, right? What is important here is to stress that we're not making a genetical thing. We're making it literally a moral, a cultural one, right? We know that Europeans are, the product of many other pre-existing populations to the Indo-European ones, and there is no doubt of this in any of the mythologies of these peoples, right? This is extremely important. The presence of the Tectonic forces. Think about the giants in the Germanic mythology, of the Titans in the Hellenic one. They always show a world where the conquerors have come to coexist in a sense with the subjugated forces of the earth, etc. So these pre-existing agricultural populations that somewhat also challenge the order, right? Think about, especially in Germanic mythology, that's quite strong, right? The weight of that of those forces is quite also negatively met, because at some point there should be a fall, right, of the celestial gods, or at least an important killing of part of them by the hands of these forces. So it's this had also, as many other cultural, anthropological consequences in some cultures and so on, but that we know better mostly for other, for later cultural development, adaptations, and artistical interpretations. But it's important to stress this early dynamic, right? So we're talking mostly of a spiritual dimension here that is the one that, strikingly enough, and not so much if you consider so many other similar waves of conquest that managed to culturally regenerate, in a sense, the principles, the values, the morals of the people, so much that the majority would be not belonging to the stock of the conquerors, but they would become culturally the same of the conquerors. There's an important thing. It is the same thing happened after the Roman Empire, right, with the Latin Germanic Europe. It's meaningful because you wouldn't understand why such more culturally productive peoples like the sedentary ones eventually came to assimilate themselves also to this element of conquerors, and naturally, as we will see now, maintaining, and still to this day, this kind of more Tectonic, telluric, fatalistic dimension that is somewhat taking over again in the broader process of modernization and secularization. But that's another thing. what is we could say characteristic about the Roman man, right, in his culture and civilization is the presence of power within the same, right? It's the idea that the same force was at the center of their own action, right? Just as in the primigenial Indo-European mythology. And we can't naturally, this is all compared Indo-Europeistics, but even just the linguistical or cultural connections with, the Roman, the Veda, all these things, and basically all the Indo-European mythologies, as we will see now. And there is, so this radical moral drive, right, that came to mold the matter of pre-Roman Italy, elevating it morally, right, to change the history of mankind forever, for good. There are definitely many elements within the same Rome, the other Italic peoples of such Tectonic, of the originally, Tectonic, Telluric, feminine dimension of the Mediterranean peoples indeed. We've seen it in Greece as well, the cult of the goddess, the Mother Earth, Gaia in that case, typical of the Pelasgian populations. We find this as an important presence, albeit a bit more mitigated, even among these prevalently culturally Chthonic peoples, right? But still mixed with some, celestial figures, but evenly among the Siculians, for example, and the Sabines, the latter of which, as you know, would be crucial also ethnically to form the original Rome. For example, the Sabines had their greatest deity in the Chthonic goddess Fortuna, right? Then appears in the surroundings in central Italy, in many areas at different, let's say, with the different forms that the primitive Italic populations had at that point. They were more similar to animism rather than, even that is an improper term, right? But, politheism, let's say, with a more defined, also anthropological figure of the deity, like in Greece, right? Something very different from the Italic cultural background. But we find them in so many places, even, today are visitable archaeologically, so these various shrines, sanctuaries, sacred groves, and all sacred places, like dedicated to Horta, Feronia, Vesuna, Heruntas, Diorae, Hera, Juno, the same Venus, Ceres, the Bona Dea that we will see now, that have, importantly, Demetrian characters, right? And that are essentially, even if you just look at them in art, right, in spite they emerged surely from different local deities. In origin, in our very archaic times, they fundamentally reincarnate the same divine principle of the Mother Earth. Even the oldest Roman calendar was actually of feminine, lunar type, right? The early Roman myths are plenty of female figures. The Mater Matuta, Luna, the Moon, Diana, Egeria, as well also, figures, in fact, so animistic in the nature of springs, of, even, very modest places, but that contained those spirits that were chtonically meant, like properly being within, not coming from the skies, right? Coming from the earth. And there are many pairs that associate also, male and female, that stress the compresence of the two elements, right? There are many traditions about Mars, Hercules, and Flora, Hercules and Larentia, Numa and Egeria. And so, in spite of the Roman, the development of Roman religion and power, and this, dramatic, virile, militaristic, celestial affirmation, there's a lot in Roman culture that is reminiscence of this archaic theme, right? Also kind of Italic one that the Romans had absorbed, of subordination of the masculine to the feminine principle. And this is important because Roman civilization, as you know, evolved quite rapidly, right? It kind of boomed. So differently from the Greek one, as I was saying before, it didn't have actually the time to, to structure like an alternative fixed religion in a more outlined form. Also because the same, Indo-European principle in this sense was, just inspiring pure action, something that had to be exemplified in the behavior, in the belief, not much in the Romans despised literature, right? Any form of, that kind of contemplative, mystical abandonment to pathos, and they would just act as a principle of sacral purity, right? So these other traditions, beliefs remained, right, albeit very primitively unrefined, but still as the substratum that had preceded the rise of Rome. The Etruscan element, as we will see now, is also very important. Think about the saga of Tanaquil. Well, she, this woman who has a dramatic importance, an Etruscan queen that also would rule over Rome. So in the face of this struggle, as you know, between the foreign kings and the Latin aristocracy in the city, where indeed the Etruscan element is mostly, associated to the Tectonic feminine one, while the Latin aristocratic one with the virile, and celestial one. And so eventually the Romans kind of epurated even, let's say, the legacy of sagas like Tanaquil's one, where, for example, the women exercised the role of priestesses, right? Not just she was a queen, but, properly Etruscan culture brought that in Rome to a sort of Roman matrona. So the symbol of, the maternal virtues of the Indo-European female breeder of heroes and warriors. As you know, the Etruscan element here is paradigmatic because it's literally the one that founded Rome in the truer essence of what properly we see, starting with the chameleon reforms, what we call the Republic, which never existed historically, but the story is set at the end of the 6th century BC, but fundamentally it happened during, say, the end of the 5th, the beginning of the 4th, where the Latin aristocracy essentially reacquired as a feudal power, basically the lordship of the city, after these periods of Etruscan suzerainty, which consisted in single noblemen who were called by the same aristocracy to help maintain control, right, as it happens many other times historically, but with this Etruscan element of bonding with the plebs, so with the Tectonic telluric element of the pre-Indo-European, ideally, right, of the pre-Indo-European population, bit subjugated by the Roman, by the Latin feudal aristocracy, and that contributed also. The Etruscans, as you know, were quite advanced technologically. The trades, the craft, etc. Those developed also Roman development. The same political, meaning the polis, development of Rome is tributed to the Etruscan system. The idea of the city, right? Not just of the tribes that join into it, but the walls, the laws themselves. That's quite mixed up chronologically in ways that we have explained. We made videos about archaic Roman warfare, the foundation of Rome, according to this. If you go into the Roman history playlist, you will find the actual interpretation of what we know today to have chronologically happened. But the rise of Rome, the one literally takes off, right, to start conquering, up until the world was unconquered, fundamentally starts with at the end of the Etruscan kingship, where the patres, the center, the Italic nobility, together with other foreign elements, were called in to maintain even there the balance. managed to, incorporate also the plebs into the citizenship system, and to start becoming an imperialistic and systematically aggressive and, in fact, imperium, as we'll see, oriented power that wouldn't stop essentially in front of anything. And these Etruscan element is quite fascinating, right? And it can be seen, and I don't know, think about Servius Tullius, who achieved power thanks to a woman and became champion of the plebeian rights. That is like a bit like in the Middle Ages, right? The Italic aristocracy thought they were somewhat even quasi-racially superior, right? Properly as a stock of the conquerors, where the rest of the plebs were the peasants were considered barely human beings and subjugated to that system. So the siding with the agricultural dimension, with the the one of this pre-Indo-European masses that had been brought down, was a way to winning them against the aristocracy. It's the same game that happened basically all over human history, that the king that sides with the people. And so all the myth that we've been fed that the king is the tyrant, actually mostly the main problem is the oligarchy, right? It's the aristocracy that wants to rule without really a head, and maintaining their control on the population in a privatistic sense, which is what you wouldn't expect about the deepest nature of Roman culture, as properly the one that in fact remained leading Rome. Sometimes I smile when people think that Rome had anything republican or democratic in its essence. Rome was always an oligarchy that eventually became a monarchy. It had nothing republican or nothing democratic in it by any stretch of the imagination. In any case, but again, we were fed on purpose this delusion, right, that today is historiographically crumbling on all the fronts, and there is no way to sustain, and nobody basically, unfortunately, teaches any of this anymore, anywhere. And this damaged, right, centuries of Western civilizational development in the truest essence of its own identity. It's something appalling for the sheer moral and material damage that derive from this. And Servius Tullius not only sided with the plebs, but also was conceived, according to myth, during one of the many orgiastic feasts celebrated by slaves who devoted themselves to the cult of typically Tectonic deities. So this is naturally the Roman version of the idea of the perversion that such power, against nature represented. We're talking about actually tonic forces that, as you know, would be maintained in Roman religion, like Saturn, Venus, Flora, right? Many Romans thought actually to descend from that element. So that it is some of the Patricians, of course, as you know well, and this reveals, of course, how much the Romans were aware of the fact that they still owed a lot in all their history. If you think about the struggle between Patricians and Plebeians as the leitmotif of the early period of the Republic, that the recognition of such blending, such dichotomy, that probably helped dramatically also in negotiation terms to boost Roman civilization forward properly in a civil sense, as in many other historical situations where conflict is at the root of civilization. And so these plebeian forces, supported by the Etruscan kings, were essentially expressing this idea of unmitigated equality between all people, the promiscuity in this materialistic dimension, of the Mother Earth, right, and properly as a Tectonic subterranean cults that denied the warlike celestial culture of the aristocracy. So Etruscans and Sabines also had traces of matriarchal systems. Matriarchal societies are not really frequent historically. Here, mostly it's a matrilinear thing anthropologically meant, but it's still meaningful to see how peoples, especially the Sabines, were so close to the Latins within the Italic dimension, were, had both into this pre-Indo-European cultural influence. And there are many similarities also between Etruscan culture and the Minoan one. Have been stressed even artistically in the forms. They're surely almost self-evident independently from the actual origin of the Etruscans. For example, the Etruscan and Sabine inscriptions show filiation through the name of the mother instead of one of the father. And so women were attributed in these cultures particular honor, authority, importance, and freedom as well. As you know, the Indo-Europeans weren't particularly liberal with their wives, and even many Italic cities, right, were named after women. Importantly enough, the big divide, the ritual burial. The Indo-Europeans preferred cremation. This is evident among the Latins that eventually, began to inhumate instead. But originally, within these peoples, there was always a social differentiation among that base, as we will see. For example, among the various Roman gentes, the only one that kept inhumating was the gens Cornelia. Right, famously enough, there are beautiful sepulchres, and part of the reason was that they were very devoted to the telluric figure of Venus. But the other senatorial families preferred cremation. This was the Indo-European idea that the soul had to elevate itself to the skies to sit next to the in fact Uranic gods, whereas the pre-Indo-European peoples preferred inhumation, as their body and soul would come back to the deities of the underworld, right? And this was a radical divide, culturally speaking, that we find in spite of this promiscuity in the pre-Roman and even in the same Roman reality within the same communities. Actually, was maintained and remained quite importantly identified. There is in the same Roman culture, as you know, a great importance attributed to maternal sacredness and authority. The matronarum sanctitas, or the mater princeps familiae. It's the same reason why we use the term matrimony today, because that of the rising of the children was a womanly business, and where the woman in that had a radical power, and it remained, in fact, in this Western terminology as well. And this aspect too probably betrays that pre-Indo-European gynecocratic element that was proper of the local populations. This, however, didn't prevent the some other differences. The Romans were, however, gradually able to to isolate this dimension in the sphere that competed to it. For example, Saturn, or it would be Kronos itself, had some of its original traits of Roman culture in kind of a more celestial dimension, but it was also portrayed rather as a telluric demon, and the husband of Ops, the earth, is a bit like Hades and Proserpina in the mythology, right? So something that pertained to the underworld, where was very different from the Roman religious system. Even the same figure of Mars is ambiguous, but this is true also in other Indo-European mythologies, right? Think about the cult of the wolf. We'll come back to that, right? But it's very dual, because it's still the wolf of the Hyperborean light, right? But still this kind of dramatically chthonic demonic force, right? And there is some important aspect of that, because of course there is a sort of passage ritual even in the warlikeness of these populations that had to make them pass ideally from the Tectonic to the Uranic age. You know that Mars was, part of the archaic triad, so properly at the very root of the Roman religion. That even before the Romans hadn't split yet, a bit like the Germans, the figure of, the Godfather and the divinity of war, right? In the case of the Germans, it was still Woden in its own thing. The Romans eventually split the two, but the figure of Jupiter is still fundamentally approximatable like that. These are all, never be fooled by eventually what has been, right, in the Hellenistic phase of Rome, the adaptation of these deities to the Hellenic artistic forms, and so the better definition of the deity proper, right? The Romans had a much more, primigenial, archaic, primitive understanding of these forces, something almost in fact, just like the early Germanic religion. Even Vesta, that, in her sacred fire, so the ultimate principle of Indo-European identity in absolute level, is in fact female, right? And this betrays, a pre-Indo-European influence in Roman culture. And because in all the other mythologies that the deity of fire is male. And in fact, Vesta at some point was also associated with this other figure we will talk about later. There is the Bonadea, who was worshipped as goddess of the earth and celebrated secretly at night. And by the way, men could not participate to her cult, so stressing the fact that did not pertain to the Indo-European side of the story, mostly to this plebeian Tectonic forces. What is interesting is that the Bonadea in archaic Rome was something, was a chaste figure, like of the Demetrian form, whereas it was eventually taken back in Rome in much later times, in kind of the age of decadence, and associated with uninhibited sexual promiscuity, right? Whereas, however, Vesta in this sense was completely the opposite, right? The Vestals, as you know, had to be virgins, and yet Roman, the Romans themselves, Romulus descended, as you know, from this fact that whereas heroes fundamentally sons of Mars and of a Vestal that in a sense had broken her virginity, but for a god, and it's creating a stock of heroes fundamentally. And yet Vesta, which retained a maternal dignity, was albeit respected, yet subordinated to the authority of the Patres in Rome, right? For example, her cult was subjected to the Pontifex Magnus first, and eventually to the Imperator later. So this, the official cult of fire in this sense had been entrusted to priesthood by Romulus at the beginning, and while in Romulus' time Vesta's cult was entrusted to priests, later on it was King Numa who introduced the Vestal virgins proper as a Sabine and lunar influence in Roman religion. And the Vestals who lost virginity or let the sacred fire exhaust, but Rome would have fallen at that point, but they had lost virginity, they were buried alive, so they were damned forever, and in this sense, swallowed by the demonic telluric dimension, to which still the Patres thought that this female this female institution at that point belonged. And the Roman tradition attributes to the Sabine Titus Statius, this external element of Tectonic character, the introduction in Rome itself of some of the most important Tectonic cults, such as the ones of Ops and Flora, Ren, Juno, Curis, Luna, and so other figures like the Tectonic Cronus listed, Diana, Vulcan, even the Lares, right? The Lares were, initially, or at least in this context, Tectonic, right? It's later Roman culture that fundamentally transformed them into some kind of heroic figures, typical of the Patrician families in the Roman funerary cult, right? And so these phases of transformation of the Lares, as initially considered as children of Accalarente, for example, so the equivalent of the same Bonadeus and the Mother Earth, and their plebeian element, so that were slaves playing an important role even in officiating their celebration, would be surpassed, right? And so the Lares became some kind of hypostasis of the familiar heroes, right, of divine spirits and souls that had managed to overcome death, right? And so rising above mortality and essentially ascending the skies in the Indo-European guise. St. Augustine wrote about this, for example. That the Sabine injection in Roman culture is quite important because this aggregative moment of Roman history after the Etruscans were overthrown, where the Latin oligarchy didn't make it alone to control the plebeian forces that are dramatically developed in Etruscan times. So they injected these other surrounding elements of the Sabines that, however, brought with them this Tectonic element. Very important in Roman history are, of course, the Libri Sibyllini, or Libri Fatalis. So something very alien to Indo-European religion that fundamentally stressed a kind of fatalistic vision of the world, right? And that somewhat winked at the plebeian component of the Roman religion as well. This also dates back to the Sabines, and so also the introduction of other, the same Great Mother again, in the system, and a lot of Tectonic deities, right? The Pater, Flora, Saturn, the triad Ceres, Liber, Libera. The latter is significant because Ceres, is essentially the equivalent of Demeter in a way, and Libera stresses not just the male and female element equated, which for a Roman senator would be the end of the world, but specifically the fact that Libera, these are half freemen, right? So these are essentially the people belonging to the ancient subjugated populations that at the time in the European invasions, as the Vedic example also ferociously shows, were all slaves fundamentally, had been violently subjugated in a caste system, and now we're kind of reacquiring importance instead in a very different italic dimension, where of course wealth was kind of more heavenly distributed, right? So this is a bit the prerogative also of the Italic peoples in this regard, that had maintained, in spite of this Tectonic influences, their kind of still tribal warlike element, differently from the Etruscans, for example, that were essentially a completely feudal society in the measure in which they had a radically stratified society. I mean, there was just a bunch of noblemen, and all the others were all or peasants in a way, which may seem even contradictory by a certain degree, but not if you look at their religion, what these people still believed, and how even their Tectonic element had prevailed. The Umbrians were, for example, bordering the Etruscans, were still, as Italics, very, very similar to their Western neighbors, and so they had acquired, they were very similar in that form of society. As we'll see, the Etruscans are also kind of, they're dominantly Tectonic, but they also had some Uranic element. And so these influences can be measured very well, so philologically, etc. The many other peoples that eventually Rome, conquered all over Italy, maintained this kind of, pre-Indo-European phase, at least in a prevalent cultural sense. And so this is particularly even at the southern you go, right? There are some passages, even from Horace, historically speaking. This is for all the people who believe that the Roman Empire was, there was no such thing like any form of ethnic discrimination. It was just the multiculturalist dream of the, of the early 2000s, and, it's a pure lunacy, even, and actually a radical ignorance in Latin literature and, the most, elementary, notions of Roman history. For example, so this distrust towards the southern narrative, even the darker and the short, that this is expressed by Roman culture, by the way. And so this is, I understand it's disturbing in a way, but it's true historically. And so there is no way we can get around that. There were literally slave peoples who were identified in the south of the Italian peninsula. For example, the Lucanians and the Bruttians were, so we're talking about southwestern Italy fundamentally, were said to have been by the majority composed of this, demographically at least, by this pelas, of slave element, right, of belonging to the pre-Indo-European peoples, right, and that had been, in fact, as eventually overrun by the Oscans, by the Italics, and so also maintaining a divide within the same Italian peninsula, because the Lucanian Bruti are considered Italic, but interestingly enough, at the time of the Punic Wars, they sided with, in the struggle against Rome, and after their defeat, they were sold into slavery, which is something, for example, that the Romans didn't do with the Samnites, that were Oscans, and they sided with Hannibal, as you know, because they were some of essentially the proudest, the proudest anti-Roman Italics, that the only ones, in fact, that the Romans actually respected. Like in the entire Italian peninsula, the only peoples that Rome thought were they're competing with them, also because they were also defeated at some point, and they put them at the same Rome at risk, were the Samnites, right? And the Samnites would have been deported or other things, but surely some were sold in slavery as well, but not as an entire people, right? There was some sort of consideration, also, some sort of kinship perceived, whereas these other southern peoples were, after the Punic War, were simply obliterated. So there is something radical there. So the idea properly that an entire people was kind of felt less than the other, and this resembles dramatically the Indian aristocracy of the Arya that stood before the servile caste as a dominating stock, right? As opposed to this aboriginal one. And so the same can be seen within the same Rome in the opposition between patricians and plebeians, right? So Rome had this too, and many other, what I would like to stress is not much just of an Indo-European interpretation. This, as we've seen happen in other times in other history, the idea that the conqueror is essentially the strongest, the bravest, the superior one, and the others lose any right just for being defeated, right? This is something that recurs dramatically often in world history. And there was this went by an anthropological contempt. So the plebeians were kind of the maternal, feminine, material principle, right? The one that had not to be excluded per se, but had to be, as the rape of the Sabines show, literally, brought forcibly under, quite literally meant, while the patriciate of Rome derived its superior dignitas from the paternal, virile, military, uranic right. So, as you know, the plebs managed to become part of the Roman state, right? Some plebeian magistracies were, at the time of the rise of Rome and the creation of the chameleon army, so that's called the democratic, meaning what we mean here, people. So levies, right? Labor and fighting force for still an aristocratic Rome to conquer other peoples. Endowed with imperium as well, but this was derived, right? The plebeians did manage to participate to the ius quiritium, that was in fact literally the one of the covires, so the peoples in arms altogether. The same Sabines had brought that, right? The same, before we were reading about Juno Curis, etc. So the Sabines had, as Italic peoples who were pretty warlike in themselves, they had this still idea of the ancient tribal unity and freedom. So that had been brought under this war bands, right? Packs of warriors. And so there was this ambiguity that allowed the plebeians to participate. But nobody in Rome ever, right, in no political, juridical institution connected the plebeians to the superior charism of the patriciate, right? There is a famous phrase that the patrem quiere posse, right? And so this idea of allowing divine ancestry, of the divi parentes, right? So the divine ancestors, right? Divine parents, was never shared by the patriciate with the plebs. So they were just something else. They could prove the fact that could be integrated, because as we know, Rome did a lot of that, as we've just, seen. But let's say, the elites, right? That plebeians came to power were not the shopkeepers, were, merged with really powerful people within the same people, right? Within the same plebs. But for the rest, the latter would be seen as the children of the earth, right? Literally emanating from this humus of, inferior nature, as that was molded in this metaphysical clash between the celestial deities and the telluric forces of chaos and etc. that you find in all the mythologies here of these people, the Indo-European peoples. Speaking of the Etruscans, as we know, nobody really knows where they came from specifically. It's like one of these peoples, like the Basques or the Ligurians, that nobody really has a clear idea. And the erudite Roman tradition, but was quite kind of anecdotal. Think about Seneca that says the Tuscos Asia sibi indicat, right? So different ideas have been put forward. Some say that they descended from the Turcers, of the sea folk that you find in the Eastern Mediterranean, who invaded Egypt towards the end of the 18th dynasty. Some say that the Etruscans were sort of a hybrid still between the Italics and the pre-Indo-European peoples in Italy, that somewhat share some characteristics even with the aforementioned peoples, like the Basques or etc. It's not easy. It's not even dramatically important. We've seen that the Etruscans were quite passionate about Eastern culture. They brought a lot from Greece itself. There is even in their panoplies, we made a video about the Etruscan hoplites. But even before, there is a lot of Minoan influence in their original phase. But still, we see that this might be even just stylistic imports and not really being what they looked like. In any case, they bought into the Pelasgian world, in the Tectonic world as well, right? And there is indeed a telluric and mostly lunar and priestly civilization at the root of Etruscan identity that eventually made it into the Roman world. This, however, element that the Romans feared, as we'll see now, but maintained distinct from their own Latin institutions. That is exemplified in Etruscan religion, like in other peoples that we do understand to have been influenced by Indo-European, in this kind of celestial vision, such as the Assyrians or the Chaldeans, right? That do have mostly Tectonic and deities of fertility, and these various monsters, yes, demonic forces, but probably the matters of nature, so all these kind of subterranean forces that rule, but also did contemplate some celestial virile forces. Even at the top. In the Etruscan case, it's the case of Tinia, right? But, differently from Roman religion, that we will see better in a while, the such celestial deities in Etruscan religion, the so-called dii consentes, are not purely celestial deities, or at least they don't own that kind of unmitigated sacral primigenial force deriving from the skies as a superior principle, right? Because they did not actually possess a real suzerainty. On the contrary, there was a shadow hanging over them, an occult power that in Etruscan culture could not even be named, right? And that was represented by the so-called dii superiores et involuti, that is to say, properly veiled, that were concealed. And thus, there is a fatalistic and naturalistic element to the Etruscan celestial dimension. It fundamentally subordinates even the Uranian figures to something obscure, tonic, right? This is important because even in the video about the Hellenic religion, we have seen how the Pelasgians looked at, when they met with the Indo-Europeans, they looked at Zeus and they conceived him to a sort of, properly of demonic telluric force that had been brought under by the Stygian king Pluto, right? So that had been dominated by the chthonic forces of the underworld, tamed, right? Whereas the Hellenes believed something else, that of course Zeus was something Olympic, superior, light, albeit even in there, at least according to Hesiod's, the theogonies, still the Olympic gods, Zeus included, are generated, and that are generated also by a Titan, by the way, so by the subterranean force, right? Whereas the Romans did not know any kind of this. As we'll see, Jupiter is an ungenerated, unmitigated universal force that just eventually also produced some other hypotheses in the name that eventually were more characterized like Mars and all these things, but that fundamentally were not dissimilar from the more primitive unitary, compromised view of, like of Woden, for example, as this superior force of, military and religious power of the skies. In fact, the Romans, as we will see, didn't even consider the gods properly as gods, right, as deities. They considered them as pure force, which is powerful, literally. So the Etruscan civilization actually shows like a decline of light, right? The idea that there is a unbearable end in the womb of the earth, the laws of which fundamentally superstate any other entity. It's a pretty dark one, right? And there is a pessimistic view of the afterlife in Etruria, right? Nobody has, not even the most exalted people, the strongest heroes, etc., have any hope of immortality or even of heavenly survival. Rise towards the sky. There is no trace of this in the Etruscan culture. And so there is almost an obsession with that, and this, in a sense, fortunately left us with the beautiful Etruscan funerary art, right, and all the tombs, the sepulchres for inhumation that the Etruscans built as some of the greatest, most precious jewels that produced in those times for us to narrate. And here you can see that there are dark forces, right? Mostly feminine deities of the night, of the darkness, that embodied the destiny and the sovereignty of natural law, that brought everything under, that swallowed everything into in the underworld, right? So the Etruscans were convinced that they would essentially return to that. In fact, there is even trace of the premonition of the end of their own nation in that sense, right? The Romans never thought of any of this. There is a terror of the afterlife, almost an obsession in Etruscan culture. If you look at the demons, the undertakers, it's something horrifying, right? They look all blue. They're horrible. They have demonic eyes. They bring you under. There's no way out of that, right? Think about the monster Tukluka, right? This is pretty macabre. Macabre representations. They almost represent, in fact, the Romanesque art of early medieval times, where literally that figures of hell, of the underworld, were pictured to scare the masses, the people, right? These people were brought under. So even Christianity, in this sense, inherited, the celestial dimension, of one culture, right? Whereas, properly given in Christianity itself, hell doesn't exist, right? It's a non-place. It's a failure to reach the sky. So it's not actually very different from, at least in this dimension, from what, in this case, the Indo-Europeans believed, whereas the people that of course still exist in society, are in the lower dimension, have to be, for their nature, be scared, to be put, to be tamed according to that vision. The idea that, since they can't really reach any superior, there is no hope for a qualitative improvement. They have at least to be scared, and to be terrorized by the idea that if they fail, they will be brought under, and that there's no chance, or there's just an eternal pain and suffering, right? And so to each its own, which is also morally, it's in this dichotomy, as clinical psychologists tell us, the sap of a healthy civilization, punishment and reward. So we find in the Etruscan infernal religion, fundamentally, priestly leaders of the various Etruscan houses, the various clans that ruled the so-called Dodecapolis, even though we don't even know which one of these 12 cities actually were, but famously enough, the Lucumoni, that as they were essentially kings, priests, certain dimension. So, and so you would think from these to be the heroes of the situation, as they in their sagas they were, but they regarded themselves not as celestially blessed individuals. On the contrary, they thought they were children of the earth. Think about the Tectonic demon Tagus, as Ovid talks about him in the Metamorphosis, that was traditionally credited with founding the so-called Aruspicina, so properly the Etruscan discipline, that, as you know, was imported by the Romans as well during the Etruscan period, which is a Tectonic one par excellence, because it's looking at the bowels of animals. It was filled with this idea of fear and horror. Something incumbent would happen was wrong, and it was fatalistic, lunar, as a science, where it's very similar to the Chaldean, the one of Chaldean religion that was eventually transmitted to the Hittites, right? So if you see how other Indo-European peoples were, of course, absorbing the practices of this other populations that were somewhat more developed and could have that kind of cultural influence on them as well, in spite of their more primitive and action-based idea. But this is exactly the point that is, it's a fatalistic attitude to life. It's essentially, let's not act because we are heroes that have a pure fides, as we will see, that just act because they're convinced of the worthiness of their cause, and that have to emulate in their behavior that the perfection of the gods, that do not let themselves be bowed by superstition. No, we have to look into these animals' guts to essentially, see what will happen to us. So it's immediately a passive attitude that is typical of this sedentary idea that fundamentally everything derives from the earth, right? Of its animals with a simple science, and that's the most disturbing force, right? Whereas these other conquerors had instead a greater idea of what the whole moral system was fundamentally in worldview and language and ethics and so on, be derived from the celestial movement. So as you know, the Romans at least partly incorporated the Aruspicina into their augural signs of the augurus that instead were something else. And they were also, so much more in fact, they were to look at the skies, right? The celestial bodies is something else. That was to essentially imitate their perfection, not to tell what would have happened, right? So it's very different from astrology, right? In fact, the Romans forbid that. Utter bullshit is that the Romans were religiously tolerant, right? No people was tolerant at the time, at least in the modern sense, as we intend, and especially a civilization cannot be tolerant, especially towards this kind of deresponsabilizing superstitions. But in any case, of course the Romans also believed in astrology, but everybody did, but it was still this celestial principle, right? And so it's just like in the Middle Ages, Christianity stressed that, but people still believe in astrology. As long as that didn't conflict with the Bible, nobody claimed anything in dangerously theological, anti-theological terms or heretical terms. Everything was fine, kind of. So there is always the coexistence of these two elements, the Uranic and Tectonic, right? It's not avoidable, right? The problem is what does prevail, right? So the Augures were a patrician college, as you know, that had allowed the Etruscan aruspexes, so the ones that practiced the Aruspicina, to practice their art. And the Augures would talk to them, which does show not just the process of Roman integration of, subjugated peoples and the adoption of their deities and all these things, as we've seen, but there was always a hierarchy in that, right? There was sort of religious feudalism. But actually it shows that the Romans cared about this because they recognized, in a sense, the power of the forces of the underworld. It's just that they were something that remained alien from their own personal commitment as patricians. But since they had to cooperate with these other peoples that were lived in the same place, they had to listen to what they thought, and at least what their own deities thought, which was important. Because there was a real contrast. These forces were thought to be real and to be, also antagonistic. But the important here is that the Augurs would never deny their own superiority. On the contrary, there are examples as we see now where the Aruspexes actually betrayed the Romans in this regard, lying, and so being by the Indo-European standard, if you lie, you can't have the military glory of the sky, the imperium, anything, right? This is exemplified even by the Rig Veda, what we understand by these Indo-European standards. And in fact, there was an element in here, parallelism with the same Persia, because when the Romans rebelled against the Tarquinians, that is to say, the Latin aristocrats kicked out the Etruscan king from Rome, such expulsion was celebrated, right? The expulsion of that specific dynasty, none of the Latin kings that also existed, but the Etruscan ones, was celebrated in Rome in a way that was dramatically similar to the Megaphonia. It was essentially the massacre of the Median priests who had usurped the regality after Cambyses' death in the Achaemenid Empire. So you understand what's the deal here, because even in the Achaemenid Empire, it would be here. Let's not descend into details, but it's still the idea that the warrior has, the lead in that sense, and so the priests have a specific role that cannot usurp the certain prerogatives in that culture. In any case, and it depends, because in the Veda it was different, but still, the repartition is important. As we were saying before, the Romans were always diffident to and fearful of the Auspecs, because they saw them as an occult enemy of Rome. There is an example when, for example, the Auspecs asked to have the statue of Ratius Cocles buried at some point, and they had emanated an Aruspicium to prove this. They said, the Aruspicina told us that you have to bury, the statue of this Latin hero and this Roman hero, and that, because otherwise bad things would happen. So actually, what the aristocracy did was they erected the statue on the most elevated place in Rome, so that lots of positive things began to happen. So at that point, the Auspecs were accused. They were brought to confess the fact that they had falsified the Aruspicium, which is an infamy also by their own standard, and were executed because they had betrayed Rome. So they were a disloyal force to Rome, because they were seen as, at least from the Uranic perspective, as the ones that were competitively damaging the Uranic establishment. So what is central to Roman religion was the virility, the manhood and warriorhood manifested in the same doctrine of the res publica, that was considered as such, as essentially the ancient assembly of the freemen in the war band, right? That maintained, in this sense, an auctoritas, in virtue of which, literally, they would deserve the imperium, right? And the Olympic, Uranic, Celestial, whatever you want to call it, dimension, particularly embodied by Jupiter Capitolinus, was an entity per se, right? It was sovereign, ungenerated, so it wasn't subjected to any form of tectonic birth, regenerate, all these things. It was independent, detached, right? No material dimension to it. And it was, at least originally, not separated from properly the concept of regality, meaning the ones who would have to rule Rome. That is to say, the adytum et initia regis. That is to say, that the Roman kingship was seen, as you know, eventually Rome maintained always an oligarchy, but the idea that there had been a sole ruler, originally the head of the war band, Romulus, with his celeres, so the typical Indo-European war band that went around conquering, killing the men, raping the women, and creating a new people and ruling in the virtue of their celestial superiority, military virtue, were associated to the adytum would be, in the ancient temples, the most sacred part, right? So the idea that the consecration of the kingship was associated to the same absolute principle of the deity of war and of the skies, Jupiter Tonans. And of course, such mystery of regality was inaccessible to ordinary people, because, of course, you could prove to be one, but in this sense, just the elite could afford that. just the elite had the moral superiority to live that kind of lifestyle. And so the Indo-European migrations were, in origin, it's still a meta-historical concept in this context, because the Romans, as we've seen, had somewhat re-emerged as inspiring themselves to that model. Of course, proven that there were peoples who could, others who couldn't, because some were defeated, others not, right? So there was this belief that, of course, the Jupiter was the deity of the skies that was incompatible with the deities of the underworld, not opposite, an enemy, and still superior, because those were the peoples that had come to rule over the pre-existing inhabitants. So the imperium, that is what we should start learning in terms of power, the mystical, dreadful force, faculty of command, right? Not in the sense of empire, in a nationalist, statalist, geographical sense, properly. The idea of the faculty of power that manages to bring peoples under. It's not a territory that you rule, it's the communities that you rule. This is the reality of life. This is from Clausewitz. Became a prerogative not only of the political leaders as such, right, but of the patricians that were the heads of the various clans, right? So the idea, anyways, that these were the initial war band that had taken over the local communities, had maintained a social segmentation, so the household, properly, the people that were, the patres that had, in this sense, they shared by their own auctoritas, literally the power of life and death on all the members of their household, right? So relatives included, but obviously also all the serfs, all the slaves that worked for them, right? But they were, as you know, this is meant in an heroic way, and as we've always seen, and this was feudal Rome, was the idea that there was a, the ultra aristocracy, and then, lots of other people fighting alongside them, and you see that also in the Roman stratification of society that reflected even in the army, that, yes, did stress the participation of various classes of freemen, right? But still, there was a difference within it. Of course, we see mostly the later phase where the civic system was already well outlined and so on. But initially, also serfs, of course, it's just like in Greece, right? We think just of the hoplites, of the citizen soldier, but you always see even in art just these no ones like slingers and javeliners outside of the phalanx that obviously were not citizens as such. And so the Roman world was much, as we've seen, more primitive and brutal and barbarian in nature. So these were mostly kind of war bands with an internal segmentation originally, transforming into something else, because also Rome was rich, as we've seen, and so it wasn't just a literally feudal society. There was also this trade plebeian element that the Etruscans had nurtured to provide Rome with that demographic strength that eventually the Patricians managed to keep under and to transform into that ruthless military machine that we all know. So there is a centrality of fire, as in all Indo-European traditions in Roman symbolism, which stresses the core of its spirituality, this celestial spark of divinity through which the heroes are forged, right? In fact, the later Italian Enlightenment author Vico stressed the heroic nature of that law, right? He was an important scientist of the 18th century, and even from that background, he couldn't but stress, of course, the radically aristocratic character of Roman culture in that sense. Was a an ethics of honor and faith, right, in line with all the war band, tight connections between the sworn brotherhoods of warriors and through blood to sacred fire, through this initiation, to this most radically brutal and traumatizing and unspeakably violent selection that had made Rome itself in the origin, according to legend, but telling us that the story that we've seen so many times at the time of the Indo-European invasions. And we can find also in other Italic peoples, by the way, that were less developed than the Romans, even at the time of the conquest, that then maintained that kind of crude lifestyle. The Italic Spring, for example, is quite an interesting thing from a psychiatric point of view, and same thing of the rape of the Sabines. Now, so honors and fides, these are the central meanings of Roman ethics that was so strongly felt that, according to Livy, became also internationally a trademark of the Roman people. Right? What is fascinating about the rise of Rome is that this is what was documented by peoples that were kind of looking at it, of course, as amazed by a divine force that was rising, because nobody at the time thought in an unsecularized way to say, these are winning for no reason. It's just a rationalistic explanation. The world was freaking out. We're realizing that the Romans, so these newcomers that nobody would have even thought that would emerge from that Italic mess, with no order, were literally taking over the world. So what kind of gods do they have from their side? And the interesting aspect of this is that the Romans, that idea of discipline of the warrior brotherhood was radically stressed. If you study the Germanic comitatus, the Gallic fiannas, think about the Viking war bands, the Huscarls, the same feudalism and so on. It's that, right? In the absence of a state that has yet to form, the idea is that if you betray the hierarchy of your senior, of the head of the war band, of these feudal Roman landlords that essentially wanted to share control over the city, you were, this is a later term, but you were kind of a barbarian, meaning that the way Romans saw barbarian was this metaphysical. As you know, the Romans were less posh than the Greeks in that terms, and they looked even in their foes and the more primitive ones, actually, that kind of spark of their own original warlike superiority. So they weren't actually by that point calling the barbary as such, because they are much of a contempt. But originally speaking, in the archaic times, of course, the barbarians were all the chthonic, titanic forces, like the giants. Even in Germanic mythology, there are the brutes, the idiots, this men nurtured from the earth, yes, but they are stupid fundamentally, because they have never actually led or conquered. They don't have the intelligence, the wisdom to command. In other words, they're not morally superior, because they come from the underground. They're fatalistic. They're mentally they have lost the initiative, mentally speaking, because they think they are subjected to forces that lay outside of them. Right? So these peoples have to be tamed, subjugated with violence, because there is a superior order that has to be established in the universe, right? That these heroes have to bring in order to rule the world. This is the truest, genuine message of Roman, of the Pax Romana, for that matter. Parcere subiectis et debellare superbos. And how this was originally conceived by the Romans, let's stress it, they were primitive, right? They made it to the top in an incredibly short time that did not allow, like, to the Greeks to gradually sediment, say, a cultural, I don't know, for example, a written culture that could, eventually process this. Rome simply boomed, right? And the root of this was what the Romans saw as the supernatural force of the numen. What's the numen? Numen is essentially sheer power, And this sheer power was that supernatural force deriving from the military deity of the sky that was perceived like 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 an experience. I mean, it's even in modern terms there is no way to express what that meant. Right now we mostly think, you say Jupiter, you see is a god in the sense that the Romans would have said instead of Deus, not of Numen. Right, the Deus is like, the politistic stereotype of that guy or that girl with those specific features, that kind of almost scriptural description. The Numen is sheer force. It's the idea that the virtus is acquired, right? As we will see now, is properly acquired and feeded by, it's like the Vedic soma, right? It's the supernatural force that provides you the faculty of command, the imperium, right? And the Romans maintained this idea up to very late times. Like Augustus was a Numen, was not a Deus. It's power embodied. It's the centrality of the sacrality of the action. And it's remarkable, and this is really the exception of Rome, that such peculiar spiritual attitude would be maintained to such, eventually, at that point, a very advanced stage of development. Because as we've seen, it was so quick that the Romans kind of didn't have the time to secularize that more than other peoples that instead did, that evolved much more gradually. So these were essentially ruling the world, still believing not in a mitigated, structured system, the contemplative idea of what their religion could be. They still reason in terms of will of power, as the Numen being the pervasive divine force in even actual human beings that you could see, right, not belonging to a strange kind of older past, right, that nobody wouldn't understand anymore. Even though even in this process the Romans had, in a sense, difficulty to translate that into actual description, and that's why they assimilated so much of the Hellenic systems, because they it's not that by the time of Cicero they understood the archaic religion anymore, because it was so foggy in a way, because it was still in an age of myth, right, that it's not really history per se. Most of what the Roman Sagas are fundamentally the reception that the Romans had towards the first century BC with Livy, with this a real elaboration of principles that at that point were, they understood, and they surely understood much better than us, and they knew much more than we do about lots of things in that sense. They had been handed down as properly as a tradition, but of which they had still maintained the essential meaning that was as direct, as effective. I made a video, by the way, on the Fortuna Caesaris, and that explains a lot of interesting things, by the way, of how a late 1st century BC Roman warlord could see himself in that metaphysical dimension, right? And as the world would see them, this is what we have forgotten about Rome, is that we have flattened everything in a kind of the desacralizing, caricatural way of obsession, of modernistic obsession with tyranny, etc. That the people that lived outside or under the Roman Empire saw these people as demigods for real, and they were interpreted as such. So this is not much just say it's Roman propaganda. This is how the world had never seen anything like the Roman Empire, and this is that had to be made sense of. And there was no other way of making sense. These people had taken over the world. How couldn't you see that? They were the chosen people. So, together with this, there is this is psychiatrically very interesting in my opinion. The fact that in the Roman world, differently, for example, from the Hellenic one, there is an essence of pathos, lyricism, mysticism towards the divine. Because these people are heroes. They don't care about that. They don't fear anything. That's the idea. Right? There is a specific law for carrying out a specific rite. There is a clear, sober view that reflects that celestial perfection to which the Roman civis is inspired by. And so it's a virile, magical attitude, right? That is intended in a magic sense, not in the superstitious one, but in fact, improperly in the lack of any kind of dependency, right? There is a very respectful, dignified relation between the Roman and is sacred, right? Because it's almost deterministic. Like, if I do this and I'm pure and I don't waver, I will obtain that, because that's how the law works, right? It's a principle of authority, discipline, order, confidence, straightforwardness, clarity, of coherence, right? So this is what it makes it magic, in the sense of, because it participates to the sacred, right? So even in later Roman, when Rome opened to the external philosophy, all these things, it still maintained a very important attitude towards the divinity, right? The Patricians looked at this philosophers and cults, especially Epicureanism, and we will see the idea that a theurgist would be somebody coping with the gods, and was respected as long as there was this morality maintained in the relation with it, was particularly important. And we see this primigenial character of Roman morality as in the early primitive Vedic, also Chinese, because this is not just about the Indo-Europeans, it was about broader view of the world, the Persian, Achaemenid periods, as much as also in the Hellenic, or even before the Achaean Olympic religion that we have exemplified. It was dramatically intense in that regard as well, looking at its heroic forms, for example. So, abandoning yourself, your soul in God, or bursting out of devotion, was alien to Roman religion, because you couldn't be worthy of the deity and coping with it otherwise, right? Properly. And the dignity, the idea of this seriousness and consistency of the civis Romanus, relating with a god as a chosen, a person partaking to the uniqueness of the Roman destiny. It was made by the Romans themselves, in this sense, in alliance with God, is the center of it all. And this still with these tectonic elements that compenetrate the plebeian element of the community, right? There are some pathological forms there. There's the terrifying representation of the underworld, but it doesn't belong to the ruling class. It doesn't belong to those who make the empire. It doesn't belong to those who command these people. On the contrary, there is a force that is able to regenerate that kind of moral dignity through the munus, through the right and duty, right, at the same time. That's why the Romans did extend their citizenship by cooptation, all these things, but it was still a radically exclusivistic process. You couldn't get it if you didn't tribute honors to the Roman deity and what it represented, what it stood for, right? And there were personified heroes in Rome, let's say, but differently from the Hellenic cycles, there are even some mortal men, right? So you think the average, but still the good Roman, right? That basically shows that lack of fear or hope, right? Concerning the afterlife, for example. Everything is about the fides, the heroism, the order that brings to that automatic, immortality. Because that's what if you're a Roman, that's what you should do, point. So there is no question, there is nobody, asking for being saved or anything, thinking that somebody else is doing it for you, but there is none of that. You do it, because you are responsible for yourself. And these values are, communitarianly speaking, the ones that keep the thing together. And there is something here unsettling about the idea that this kind of culture was the one that, out of nothing, took over the world, right? They weren't a real people, you see. They were just a community, a relatively small one, right? And without any kind of, say, territorial domination, kind of large demographic base at the beginning. So these people managed to work it out through these, at least with these mindset, that they evangelically spread in the world, by the way. And so more of that later. For example, even as we were saying before, relatively to the external cults such as Epicureanism, think about even Stoicism, right? The Romans were quite appreciative of that. When Lucretius explains, for example, in a scientific sense, the natural causes aimed at eliminating fear and death, right, and gods, and freeing human life, right? This was about, bestowing upon it calmness, a sense of security, about that confidence that reflects even in a doctrine like Epicureanism that was not, of course, Roman religion and didn't even seek to be so, but the moment in which was made proper by the Romans is kind of reflected that divine celestial ideal of impassibility, right, of an essence that is concluded in itself, that doesn't shift its moral barycenter outside of itself, that in this sense embodies perfection, because perfection cannot be reached if not by being already itself, so without any compromise. And think what somebody properly grown with this mentality can live like, even in relation to the ABC of life. It's like that idea before you did that. I don't know. The Achaemenid youth was taught never to say a lie. Can you say what is a lie, what is not a lie? So it's a principle of eternal discipline that is, creates something. Of course, this was declinated into a normal existence, and of course, this is what the Romans wrote to, as a model, as a role model. But what is meaningful is that without an actual rationalization of secularization of this principle, this is what passed down to the Romans. I mean, through the centuries, as the sap of Roman culture, without any sign of contamination, which basically no other people in this sense at that level of development ever maintained. So the Romans, as we're saying, were also looked from the external, because fortunately for us, there was somebody documenting Roman history when the Romans still didn't quite engage in much of a cultural activity in the way we mean in terms of literature, for example, philosophy, and there is something originally primitive but still, shocking about these people that others wouldn't quite understand. For example, Plutarch in Pyrrhus 1915 talks about the Epirot ambassador that comes back from his mission to Rome, and refers that, as a Greek, he would have expected to find himself in the Senate in front, like a gathering of barbarians, and instead he felt like being in the midst of an assembly of kings, because that principle of superiority was based out upon properly all these patres, all the senators of these leaders of households, because were originally all that could be all eligible as prime inter pares to any other ruler, right? This is the same, the absence properly of a let's say of a real kingship as a real monarchy in the origins, but still, conceived in the sagas as the idea that it was still the superhero fundamentally that that had founded something. But still, this sense of superiority was shared, as we've seen, in a moral sense by all these other leaders. And so that idea of the strength of Roman morality that was displayed in front of a civilized nation like the Epirotes at that point, that were still, trying to replicate Alexander's achievements, and found themselves in front of these people and said, these people have something within them. These are not like the others. And there are even more subtle traits of this sacrality in Roman culture. For example, the lapis niger, right, the black stone that Romulus put at the beginning of the Via Sacra. So properly the idea of the sign of the center from which the whole world is defined by. And so the idea that Rome is the center of the world. The number 12, that is a typically solar symbol that reflects here the Indo-European centrality of the celestial symbolism as a divine one, to be found in the 12 vultures that gave Romulus the right to name Rome herself over the last ones found by, spotted by Remus. The number of the Lictorian fasces carrying an axe, the symbol of the northern conquerors, right, and the symbol of unity of the tribe, of the people. The number of the Ancilia, the sacred shields fallen from the skies at the time of Numa, that conferred this, this kind of, sacred blessing also for the military side of the, properly the Roman arms were concerned. The pledge of command, the Pignora Imperi, and also 12 are the altars in the archaic cult of Janus. Then, unequivocally, the eagle. So, the universal symbol in every kind of human, at least, civilization, aside from, the various different fauna that you can find in various areas of the world, but the ultimate, sacred symbol of the skies, of military power, of world domination, of Jupiter himself, right? The only bird that can look straight at the sun, and becoming the signum of the Roman legions, as Flavius Josephus said, as it represented an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. This was the mission of the chosen people. The eagle in itself is the immortalizing symbol of the Indo-European glory. It's the connection between gods and men, right? During the decursio, the idea was that during the cremation of the imperator, the souls, in fact, the soul of the Caesar would take form of an eagle and fly into solar immortality together with the other gods in heaven. and this is that from this imperium all the individual merit derived, because it was what meant hierarchically speaking. During the Decursio, the Roman knights galloped around, circle around the pyre, and threw all their decorations, their symbol of acquired power into the pyre, because the hierarchical principle was that everything had derived from the sole leader, the imperator, that detained the imperium, and therefore could, every achievement that was acquired by individuals, of course, was in part, owed to them too, but it could not but derive from that principle of unity, of superiority, of a ruling civilization that was based in individual responsibility. But there are also other aspects. For example, the sacrifice of the horse. Corresponds to among the Asvamed of the Veda, but there are also in Irish mythology that because they massacred these horses with this blood, they consecrated the terrain that was the limit of the rulers of the leaders' rule fundamentally, and that horses were the sacred horses are the ones associated to the shamanic trance to which the ancient Indo-European warriors became so knights, because that's what they had to become. And a Tectonic and celestial symbol that brought the horsemen to the skies after death, but by coming from the blood of the earth, right? So there is a sort of of course, it's not without virtus you couldn't receive the imperium. There are many parallelisms in other Indo-European and non-cultures to the relevance of the eagle. For example, if somebody was approached by an eagle that came to you, right, this meant that Zeus would have predestined you to high office of regality, and together with that was an omen of victory. So you see in the Hellenic culture, it's as if the Nika was the victory, and also in Roman the Victoria were associated, in fact, as a sort of hypothesis of both the imperium and of the virtus, because they were the same thing, right? And so the figure of the angels bringing glory on these from the skies, it's like always the wing symbol. The eagle was, even among the Aztecs, crucial. Think about not just the various warrior eagles, literally, but the eagle pointed, for example, where the capital of the Aztec Empire had to be. In Egypt, the Ba was an element of the human being that was destined essentially to remain an eternal life in a state of glory. In the Egyptian hieroglyphics, that represented like a hawk, but because in Egypt they had oaks and not eagles, but it's the same thing. In the Rig Veda, the eagle carries the magic potion to Indra. I will see that this comes back in the feeding of Romulus and Remus through the same Mars, and the wolf, right? And Indra at that point becomes consecrated as the lord of all gods. And in the process, he leaves behind the infernal feminine forces that represent the Tectonic element that he's able to surpass. And so, as we were saying before, in the imperial consecratio and in the apotheosis and the Decursio, all the eagle symbolism is central to the rise of the emperor's soul to the skies, to heavens, in the immortality of the gods. So it's as if the Romans sculpted their own myth in the substance of history. The eternity of their city, the unmitigated victory of their spirit, the enormous struggle from which this had emerged from, right? That it's never like the Roman sagas never represent an idyllic situation. There is always the struggle between the good and the evil, the light and the darkness, the sky and the earth, right? The struggle between patricians and plebeians is always there. It's not a balance that you can maintain just because you have arrived there. You can't just slip on it because you've earned it. It's a way of life, and it brings the entire people beyond. And that's why participating to it means something that objectively no civilization of mankind has ever been seen. That's the idea that this ecumenic power would elect the worthy toward domination and maintain this principle in the sacrality of their power. So there are some interesting, tensions, as we were just saying, that are interesting too, that are worth remembering. For example, there's a tradition according to which Saturn Cronus created Saturnia. This would give name to the entire Latium, so the region of Rome, as the Saturnia Tellus. In fact, as Pliny said, the Saturnia ubi uc Roma est, as we'll see now. Also, anc Janus Pater by Virgil in the Aeneid, anc Saturnus condidit arcem, Ianiculum huic illi fuerat Saturnia nomen. And this was a citadel, fundamentally, a fortress, located supposedly where Rome herself would have eventually built, right? And so this would confer to, this is important because it conferred to Latium what the Romans called a latens deus, so a kind of a hidden power of chthonic nature that, let's say, made also the, if you want, the fortune of the land, that, the lower Tiber Valley was particularly fertile, right? And so also this chthonic, the metric element, brought to, the happy land, right? It was like a few others, like also the Campania Felix, etc. And in fact, as we will see, was connected to some chthonic elements, and the Romans dispensed of it culturally. There is a struggle also in some famous deities in Roman mythology, such as King Numitor and Amulius. Right? And this is fascinating because from one side we have Amulius, which is the anti-hero, seemingly embodying a violent principle, a pathetic one, right? So he attempts the usurpation of Numitor, that is, by the way, the father of Rhea Silvia, and so the mother of Romulus and Remus. And so he represents instead the Numitor represents the regal and sacred principle, that is kind of the unshakable one, whereas Amulius is the perturbing force, the pathological, the titanic one, right, the chthonic one. The same rivalry and dichotomy is found in Romulus and Remus themselves. As we've seen, there is an intercourse between a virgin in charge of tending the sacred fire, right, the ultimate Indo-European symbol of deity, and the warrior god Mars, that, as we've seen, is not exactly it was not even conceived properly at the origins of Roman culture, as we understand, but is ambivalent, because Mars is a kind of a beast-like, like Ares, right? It's a beast-like element, not just like a celestial one. It's ambivalent. It's like the wolf, and in fact, in Romulus and Remus, the same thing comes, because they are nurtured by the she-wolf. That gives them, what the Romans would have called eventually the furor, looking at a Germanic warrior later on, but actually the Führer is completely overlapping the Virtus in terms of manhood and warriorhood, right? And so this kind of divine, it's like the Vodanic fury that is actually a wisdom, and it's like the Soma of Indra, right? And that gives that kind of superiority of celestial nature. And so, but still the symbol is, as we've seen, is ambiguous, is always, can turn also dark. The ruminal, which is a tree, a fig tree, which shelters Romulus and Remus as babies, corresponds to the symbol of tree of life, that nourishes these heroes. And in fact, in Latin, the adjective ruminus was attributed to Jupiter himself, so he who provides this nourishment, and so that stemmed from the ultimate power in the sky, which does overlap with the milk of the she-wolf. In fact, there is something about, even later on, for example, about the Battle of Sentinum, where there's a passage that says properly that Mars unleashed this kind of, that there is also the episode of the wolf that runs, through the Roman ranks, and everybody cheers, and because it was actually exemplifying the presence still of these wolf warriors in the ancient Italic warfare that the same Romans, of course, had in their own original sense, still that late in time, and that kind of conferred that superiority, right? Of the thundering storm. It's like just Woden, like Jupiter is, the lightning force of the sky, and the symbol of the wolf, the necrophagous animal that brings, it's still associated with light, but also it's a necrophagous animal that brings the souls in the underworld and so on. But it's all the heroes of those fallen in battle. And so it's interesting because it's both, the wolf is both a symbol of the Hyperborean Apollo, so much that, in the Augustus of Prima Porta, if you look at the cuirass he wears, it's when the Parthians render him back the Carais eagles of Crassus, and if you look at the image of Augustus, it has a hound next standing side to him, and so that Augustus embodied himself with Apollo as a symbol, so the ultimate light of the skies. But at the same time, we know that the wolf has also a Tectonic symbology. For example, in the Norse one, the age of the wolf, strictly meant, is also the one in which the rebellious elemental powers, so the Tectonic forces, will come back out of control, which anthropologically represents the inherent tension in maintaining discipline and virtue at the same time. The Romans essentially took over the world because of this mix, which is very Clausewitzian in nature, right? The Greeks kind of idealized discipline as the superior to any kind of warriorhood. The Romans made probably one of the single most radically violent efforts in the history of mankind to transform the Italic warriors in Roman legionnaires. But the Roman legionnaire never abandoned the Virtus, the Führer. There was always an individualism in him, in spite of being, rigidly and traumatically framed, inescapably framed within discipline. That still made his warlikeness, so that there can't be any, virtue and discipline can never be disjointed to be an effective military force. And this is a very deep anthropological concept that is being re-expressed also in Clausewitzian culture. If you find it in Grimm brothers' stories, it's Scharnhorst also kind of concedes that it would be interesting to see how recent, still in time, that model was, and how it was understood still by some of the most effective militaries in contemporary history, for that matter, and that we're kind of denying now, or at least never getting it fully rationalized from these cultures that thousands of years ago had already sorted everything out scientifically, religiously, and morally, all in one, perfect depiction of reality. So, of course, Romulus and Remus seemed like Osiris and Set, Cain and Abel, so there is a lot of universal meaning there attached, and so it's always the forces you see of the underworld want to reemerge to take down the celestial gods, right? When Plutarch talks about Set, that is kind of the darker brother that kills Osiris, well, he says that they called Typhon Set in Greece because it was that Tectonic element of disorder or chaos that the celestial gods had brought under through violence, and so that mirrors the Indo-European conquest of these peoples. And also, the enemies of the solar principle of Ra in Egypt were called the children of the hopeless revolt, associated with Seth, and in this sense expressing something that came back over and over again historically. The hopeless revolt is the revolt of the fourth state, is the revolt of the inferior classes, is the revolt of the ignorant, undisciplined, irrational, incapable, morally inept element that may bring a revolution, but fundamentally is bring under a much worse, tyranny and oppression than before, because they lack the moral force to rule. Right? There's never been fortunately, in the history of human civilization, anything like the people being able to rule anywhere at any time. There has always been a hierarchy, and this hierarchy has been endowed with some superior moral force by relative standard, and was the only one that had the moral and material capacity to make civilization work. Right? So it's a deep anthropologic meaning, because you understand that in this struggle, historically, the celestial element always won. Right? So giving in to the darkness, to the Tectonic dimension, is essentially denying the value of human civilization. So, in this sense, Romulus, when he kills Remus, is because this had been disrespectful of the principle of order, limit, and law that Romulus had given by limiting the perimeter of Rome. And so Remus says, what is civilization? What is politics? What is society? There's nothing. I cross in it. That was sacred, and Romulus kills him. Right? And so that means that there is basically nothing, not even parental relations that are more important than the superiority of the moral superiority of human civilization. That is all one with the principle, the sacred principle of action. And naturally, it's a dramatic thing, right? It's a metaphysical struggle. It's internal, external, spiritual, social, right? It's expressed by basically all symbols inherent in society. It's the constant political struggle between mostly two opposite forces in our world, and in the case of Rome, it acquires a much greater importance because, as we've seen, also for the rest of the Mediterranean, basically the other great civilization had declined, had not been regenerated, and you wouldn't expect again that this thing would emerge from Italy in that condition. It was still a Mediterranean land of the south, was not, it was rich, and so the Romans surely benefited from that, but also needed this superior moral principle to bring forward, to renovate the spiritual nature necessary, to spiritual superiority necessary to rule the world, and to give it an order, an authority, a discipline, a civilization, which is factually what happened. And the antagonism between the lunar priestly component and the celestial military aristocratic one of Rome is best expressed also by the Diet Palatine and Aventine, the two hills of Rome that as you know represent the respectively the patrician power and the plebeian one. In fact, it's from the Palatine hill that Romulus spots the 12 vultures that bestow on him supremacy over Remus, right? Who had instead chosen the Aventine for himself. And there is also, after Remus is killed, as we have seen, there is the range action of the Sabines with Titus Statius that lives in parallel with Romulus and kind of finds a compromise or a coexistence that, as we have seen, much of Roman identity was this Latin Sabine mix, right, with a pinch of Etruscan. And the Sabines were kind of mostly Tectonically and lunarly oriented. There is also another struggle after Romulus' death between the Albans, that were another evident Nordic people, like among the Latins, even the same name, the Alba, the whites. That's something that recurs all over in Europe, even as an ethnonym, etc. The Alban hills, in fact, near to Rome, that started a war against the Sabines, and the inherent reason, of course, being this cultural divide. There are some other legions of mixed background actually that speak even of a further subjugation of the Tectonic element around Rome, so much that the legend says that Hercules himself was wandering around the Palatine. You wonder what Hercules did in his life sometimes. He went around, he stopped by there, and he met this good King Evander that had erected on a Palatine hill, by the way, a temple dedicated to the goddess Victory, right? And a random deity for that matter. And he had Hercules killed on this occasion Cacus. That was a typically Tectonic deity of fire that had been brought under. It's almost something different from Prometheus, like, as we've seen, Italy was a bit less, sophisticated than Greece in that sense. But it was kind of a more brutal force. But still, the idea of fire that also comes from the underworld and kind of represents the crafts, the arts and crafts of the people, the technology, that it's the eternal illusion, right? Technology wins things. It's typically Tectonic thinking of our modernistic and progressistic times. It's all about moral forces, as von Clausewitz brilliantly lectures us about. And not only Hercules kills Cacus, but also he erects an altar to the Olympic god in a cave, in the cave of Cacus. It was located on the Aventine, right? So here the dichotomy returns, and as a typical, in the struggle between the Indo-Europeans and the Aboriginal peoples. And so this naturally describing theory what had happened, with this broader, mixing the Indo-European invasions, the founding of Rome, and the establishing of the hills and so on. Interestingly enough, Hercules at some point wounds Gaia, the Mother Earth, during his peripacies, and Gaia is nonetheless the bona dea, is a sworn enemy of his, right? And there is a significant role of Hercules also in Roman mythology later on, together with the typically celestial deities of Jupiter, Mars for what it had been mostly associated to, Apollo. Cults that Macrobius in his Saturnalia tells us were excluding women. What is fascinating is that the same Aventine was the mount of the Mother Earth, symbolically. In fact, there was an important temple to Diana Luna there, so the great goddess of the night, which was founded nonetheless by Servius Tullius. So as we've seen, the ultra-Tectonic guy, the plebeian king, which is an oxymoron almost, friend of the people. And when the plebs rebels to the Patricians, they took these secessions that had occurred, that had taken refuge on the Aventine, right? In Diana Luna's temple. And here, they would celebrate the feasts in honor of the king, Servius Tullius. And the word promiscuous comes, as you understand, because what can a slave do at that point? The Aventine Hill would remain important for feminine cults that revolve around Bonadea, Carmenta, Juno Regina. These are mythologically dated to 392 BC. Juno Regina was, by the way, the deity of Veii that the Romans had deducted from the city, because you know what the Romans did fundamentally is that they, with the evocatio, they when they fought against an enemy god, that they always kind of lured in, says, if you side with, before, like with Veii, what Camillus did, if you side with us, and so you surrender fast, that's the idea, we will preserve your force. We will preserve your cult. We will not, you will live on. But if you dare oppose to us, we will erase you from the face of the earth. Gods at the time, these minor gods that were Tectonic and so inferior, could be eliminated, could be taken away. Of course, this happened through the divine force that sided with Rome, so a superior force, the one of the skies. These ones were the deities of the earth, so they were inferior. They could be literally destroyed, erased. Right? This is the level of brutality, but that stands actually behind the same Roman integration. As we've seen, this Juno Regina had been brought to Rome and confined to the Aventine so that the plebs could do whatever they wanted, given that they factually didn't count much. At least that's how the political balance had been established. And the Romans were not really happy, by the way, of this introduction. There was always a traditional resistance in general. There were also other cults there, such as the one of Faunus, but anyhow. That was telluric, but at least male, but still seen as an inferior form, as the Faunus, just as emanation of this subterranean world that was not particularly endowed with great capacities or admirable ones. And interestingly enough, when Romulus died, was transformed into a hero, which embodied Quirinus, that kind of, with the co-virus, identified the Romans themselves. So Quirinus, in this sense, was the undefeated god. Still, Caesar considered himself an incarnation of such. It represented the Roman people per se, right? As we've seen, there was some Sabine influence in that too, but it's at least it was the idea that Romulus had created Rome, and so that even these influences could be absorbed, but without eliminating the linear, the virile connection with their origin. It's at the time of Numa, instead, that the lunar, let's say, regal Etruscan priesthood, guided by a feminine principle such as the Aegaria, for example, reemerged. So it's always connected to the Etruscans in that sense. We're kings of Rome. Interestingly enough, Numa was originally ranked as higher than the Flamines. That would be the priests of fire, so like the Brahmana of the Veda, right? And so the Hindu, right? And yet Numa was opposed, still as king, to the Rex Sacrorum, that at that point was the expression of a plebeian ritual rather than a priest of the patrician rite itself. This guy mediated between the people and the great plebeian goddess, the moon. And yet, he did not own the spectio, that is to say, the right to inspect the Ruspicina, so that we're connected still to Numa, and in a sense also paralleled by, as we've seen, the patricians, the Roman patricians that could, they would eventually keep to the tolerated as a cult, but still would side with the Augurus in the sky. And this Rex Sacrorum of the plebeians ranked, according to the rituals that were performed, below the Vestal Virgins. So the actual principle of fire, as we've seen. And that's still meaningful, because eventually the Flamines would become more important than the same Numa. And there is some kind of comeback under Tullius Hostilius from the Italic side, because it's something that tries to infringe the Etruscan priestly principle, because this Roman king is essentially a typical imperator. He's a leader of men. He has, in this sense, a merely military function that, of course, is connected to the Virtus and, in fact, the Imperium itself. And he tries at some point to climb an altar, causing a thunderbolt to rend the sky in the process, by the way, which essentially is this was a sacrilege in a form, because at least from the previous establishment, given that only a priest could interfere with that sacral dimension. But that's exactly the point, is that this is the patrician warrior aristocracy that is trying to take back what belonged to them, because the sacred stood within the Imperium itself, so they could afford to do that. Whereas the Etruscan priestly class would see things in a different way. They wouldn't give to that warlike aristocratic character the sacred prerogative that it had always maintained in Roman religion, right? And there is an interesting connection to this. You see, first of all, the Etruscan dynasty of the Tarquinians come back in turn again as the Tectonic element in Rome, and their royalty is connected to the female and plebeian element, which, in this sense, reflect the oppression of the Roman patrician aristocracy. And there is an interesting connection, because Servius Tullius, as we've seen, originally son of slaves, so somebody who wouldn't dare even to stand in front of a Roman patrician, has first of all, the name is interesting, right? The Servius here is like Brutus. It's another name that is connected to the plebeian element. As you know, Junius Brutus is the idea of the founder, the Republic, right? The first tribune of the plebs. But but this name never, after the first year, the name never reappears again in consular lists, meaning that it was kind of just a regurgitation of this Tectonic element at some point that was trying to break through, right, in the hierarchy, and that didn't have any following there. It's the hopeless revolt. But there is an interesting legend that says about Brutus that there was an omen, let's say a prophecy said that from an oracle that had announced that he, what had kissed his own mother, would become king. So what Brutus did in that instance was kneeling to the ground and kissing the earth, because he considered that as the mother of all, at least in that sense of his plebeian, background. And interestingly enough, also the Etruscan Lucumoni were regarded as children of the earth. So you see here that there is a trans-social connection. It's not just a priestly class that attains that kind of, earthly element, or just the plebs, or they're somewhat heterogeneous. The Roman tradition told us that they were basically the same thing. That it was the principle to which they were referring to that was essentially inferior to the aristocratic military one. And it's kind of interesting to see how also Caesar, in his heroic saga that was, told in his times, and made a video about that, was essentially killed by somebody named Brutus. And that, in this sense, in all the ambiguity of the, in fact, it would be a child of Caesar and all this thing, and so kind of the unfaithful Tectonic that betrays the honorable celestial. And interestingly enough, the expulsion of the Etruscan gods occurred, as you know, after the killing of Servius Tullius and properly the expulsion of the second Tarquinius in 509 BC, according to the Roman tradition, which is naturally an adaptation to the Hellenic one of the Doric restoration in Athens. Right? In Athens, the same thing. It was the idea that the pre-Indo-Europeans had taken over the previous Achaean substratum. So when the Dorians reinvaded, allegedly in 510 BC, they restored their rule with the expulsion of popular tyrants. There's a deep parallelism that was seen in a cross-cultural way between Greece and Rome regarding this idea that, after all, the Tectonic forces were the popular democratic, were kind of dangerous and incapable, and would eventually end up subjugated in that sense. And so the Romans suffered deeply of this usurpation. All the story of the rape of the Roman noblewoman, and this idea of properly an unsustainable rule from the side of this external Tectonic dynasty of Etruscan tyrants that would repress the Roman feudal restores. They should have not been particularly better in reality in terms of lifestyle, but let's say at least maintained the idea that there was an individual virtue that was superior to this kind of more flattening vision. And so this expresses the, also the almost Freudian complex that the Romans had towards this Tectonic element that they struggled to eradicate from their own leadership, at least properly boosting this moral code that had to go beyond and embody that superior principle of immediate action and sacral purity that was at the base of the Indo-European religion. And there is, in fact, an incredible violence that the Romans dispensed against the enemies that embodied that kind of Tectonic identity. For example, Alba, the city of the Queen Juno, as we were saying before. We're talking especially also about the Etruscan centers per se, right? So they were the dichotomic foes of Rome. There are so many here. We're skipping so many references, let's say, to the various other symbolism attached to the various Etruscan leaders that fought against Rome and so on, even after the expulsion of the Tarquinians and so on. Indeed, there is something, for example, in the capture of Veii, that is a defining moment in Roman history, because it's properly the creation of the Roman army as we intended with Camillus, that after the victory was regarded as a solar deity, as opposed to Juno, in that sense, was seen as a telluric one. So it's the struggle between the Hyperborean Apollo and the Mother Earth in that guise. The same harsh end arrived for Tarquinia and Lucumonia that disappear from history proper. So the Romans went pretty hard on them, because they were destroying the same symbols that they had at this point, by taking matters once again, when the aristocracy again took matters in his own hands, still with cooperating with the plebs, but still making of Rome one thing, led by those original principles, to raise to the ground the symbols. And so it's more than just an action, it's the fulfillment of a destiny that basically identifies all Roman expansion and the final world conquest. And the other big centers to fall were Capua, that embodied in this case, the weakening of the Italic tribal stratum. Essentially, Capua had been an opulent center of Hellenic origin that eventually had been taken over by the Oscans of the hinterland. And so there was some aphrodisiac element in it that had corrupted the Italics, that had become somewhat Hellenized in nature at that point, up to the point of seducing via trade a part of the Roman patriciate. And so Capua, as you know, sided with Hannibal. And after the Second Punic War, its oligarchy was beheaded, and Rome took over, and it basically lost any kind of political autonomy. After having been a florid center, also a pretty rich one, in fact, which Hannibal had centered himself logistically at the same time. So betrayers of that kind of Roman principles, right, that were being imposed during the imperial expansion, that these centers were trying to resist, even by siding with Carthage, as we'll see, is the symbol of the of the Mother Earth and of the Queen, right? Think about Astarte Tanit as the goddess of Carthage, and Dido as the queen that fundamentally Aeneas falls in love with, seduces, but because of the Fides, he abandons, so much that she damns Rome, and so that's the beginning, the prophecy of the Punic Wars that would occur, and she kills herself because she's weaker, while Aeneas goes on, and thus Rome will be founded, and so on. And so when we see what happened in 146 BC, when the Romans razed to the ground Carthage, I mean, there were reasons there, surely, of deterrence, politically, strategically. Carthage was not a threat anymore at the time of the Third Punic War. But the Romans had to give an example the rest of Mediterranean to say what they were capable of doing in a moment during the crisis of recruitment. Were mostly fighting defensive wars at the end of an important, say, at the end of an important phase of expansion. So here we can interpret the fact of Rome having finally met with the Hellenic civilization, having softened up after the Second Punic War, and after the bloodbath of Cannae, most of the aristocracy had reemerged from the lower classes. They were not the older, true, noble, hardcore patricians with their high moral values. So, yes, there are socio-economical reasons, but you can see there a sort of will of Rome to wanting to reimpose that kind of older discipline that we're longing for to keep on with their work of world domination. And so even the destruction of Carthage was a symbol that had to go. Right, this as the previous cities had fundamentally razed to the ground, as they had brought that kind of element. And there is an interesting observation that has been done about the following of the Libri Sibyllini from the side of Rome, and so the welcoming of the Phrygian Mother Earth during one of the darkest hours of Roman history during the Second Punic War, that is the defeat at the Lake Trasimene. And this is interesting because this goddess was essentially the Asiatic one of prostitution. And people have said, well, why did the Romans at that point recur to it after the defeat, right? Where they, and there's been remember that the Tectonic element was always there. As we've seen, Roman culture never was devoid of it, and no culture really, no community can be. Some have said that after, let's say, this period of expansion, Rome had kind of, Rome had achieved this success, betting everything on the celestial gods, on the Uranic dimension, on the patrician cults. So when Hannibal arrived and began to strike these blows to the Roman army, that it was still soaked into that ethos, somebody began to say, but isn't it possible that we got it wrong all along, that maybe it's Tectonic gods that are fundamentally the right ones and that we should pray for in order to win this war? And this was an interesting view, because there had been debates also by the time of the Second Punic War, the necessity, for example, of expanding further not what were, there was a traditionalist Imperium wanted to, say, patriciate, that wanted to remain just into Italy. They had sided with the Imperium, others wanted to expand. While it is possible that somebody tried at that point the whole, let's say, the last card by saying, okay, let's pray to another system in a way, we should remember that, as we were saying before, with the Evocatio, the Romans tended to adopt other gods, the gods of the enemies, in case of victory. So they basically took it, probably identified in Hannibal, Carthaginian civilization, this more feminine, Tectonic oriented model, and decided to bring in one of their goddesses, say, you side with us, so that we can, in this sense, counter the enemy from within its own same religious sphere, which is yet another explanation, could be compatible with the first one. But this is, say, brief. There were moments at that point, as you know, that which the Romans made a tumultuous, that is, properly they hired slaves, like as a forced levy. They needed manpower that after these baths of blood against Hannibal, so they armed even people that were technically not part of the Imperium. There's something that was actually done by many people. So you see, you cannot really expand. The same Romans had expanded because they had co-opted the defeated, but the equality ones. So this is something you find even in Germanic tribes, that there was all the ritual that was even in their sort of simplified, or at least as far as tradition has handed down to us, the version of the ritual passage test, let's say, that was a violent thing, or the war bands, that being touched by an arrow tip. It's like, the knight stabbing later with a sword, right? It's with a slap. It's reflective of an ancient violence that had the test of the young men that wanted to participate into manhood and warriorhood consequently. So the same was done with the slaves. For increasing manpower, when these tribes depleted themselves, so they had to fight lots of other enemies. They increased the force with these emergential remedies. But it's also the way how properly these powers expanded and even survived during the migration era. And the same thing was done by Rome, in a sense, with the manumission, the idea that, yes, you're my slave, but I can free you in a way, so that you can participate still to my greatness as a half freeman and do things in my behalf. As a master, still maintain some kind of connection to you, even if you're freed. And so it's still always this idea that Rome conquers and appropriates itself of, probably the control of the defeat. But it is also magnanimous to show to the faithful element, to the one that sacrifices itself, the fact that it can participate to the power of Rome itself. So it's interesting to see, however, again, that there was really no wavering at this point, especially in archaic Roman, or at least in these early phases, even up to the Second Punic War, in a way remaining with difficulties sometimes, but still at the center, invariably, of the cultural model. The fact, without institutional contaminations, that the asceticism of action was vastly superior to the fatalistic, naturalistic element. And so, traditionally, this substantiated itself in a sense of discipline and almost military style, right? That derived from that warband that the gens was. Gens and familia were organized, as we know, according to a strict paternal right. The patres constituted the heart of Roman society. In their house, they were the priests of the sacred fire, the arbiters of justice, of life and death, over family, and the military leaders of their own people, their own slaves and clients. There were plebeians and depended on them, because it was an oligarchic system. And so they were also visibly embodied by the Senate as an aristocratic institution. And the civitas itself, the citizenship, was the embodiment of these values. That was of sacred law, in a rhythmed, orderly, numerical way that included these mystical references to the numbers 3, 10, 12, and their multiples forming the basis of its political divisions. So in this sense, reflecting the celestial divinity. And there were some cultural influences permeating in Roman culture. Think about the aforementioned Libri Sibyllini / Fatalis that were allegedly introduced at the time of Tarquinius the Superb, and they were plebeian in flavor, right? They were actually spurious and representing this Oriental Hellenistic idea of, let's say, of a fatalistic prophecy that would have to reveal who knows what, say, aside from any possible action. So Romans remained kind of they maintained it within the system, because evidently it was also kind of a way to reassure the people right? And there was some traditionalistic rigidity about the, also always fighting against the equivocal deities that have been introduced in the older times by these more Tectonic cultures that remained in power. But there is, however, always in Rome the clear understanding that that element was enemy of the order, right? That it didn't, that it was somewhat uneliminable, but it had to be kept down, right? It had to be controlled. It had to be, it's part of the same forces that Rome used. It's as if, the Patricians had been these conquerors that still somewhat, in a feudal sense, in fact, endowed their clients, the Plebeians, the other forces with, even with weapons, with arms, but in a functional sense. It's as if they directed them, but they had to have the strength to direct those masses. That's the idea, because otherwise Rome would have never had the manpower to conquer the world. And these traditionalist reactions are best exemplified, for example, by the prohibition of the bacchanalia. That were this orgiastic Dionysian, cult rites fundamentally that, were considered as, against Roman morals. And there was something that even the young Romans engaged in a kind of a rebellious, the young undisciplined people and so on. So basically all the criticism that we make now, even the youth is lost, etc. It's part of the biology to be like that, to experience stuff, and there is always this ineliminable darkness that you meet in order to reach the light, right? So that's why this tolerance exists, because it's impossible to live in a purely Uranic dimension. You need the Apollonian as much as the Dionysian in order to make civilization work. But the first one is the one that should lead, which is a different thing. And there was always a Roman suspicion towards the Asian mysteries, because they were essentially a mystical and thus unhealthy model, right? It basically, they responsibilized the individual into thinking that was some other external truth that it depended on, instead of making their own destiny as true Roman heroes, and just what a common Roman civist would have had to be like. And there was also a toleration of other exotic cults, as you know, that were also very, very, very Tectonic in nature. Think about the one of Isis, of this other Phrygian cults of fertility, all these great mothers, right? The great Mediterranean mother that had been at the center of the Pelasgian cult. So these were, reemergences that the elite said, oh, okay, if we have to lead, to rule over lots of people, so these people are going to have this kind of beliefs. Naturally, things started getting mixed up, and so now we not talk about the decline of Rome per se, but let's say it's obvious that there was something that was mixed up towards the end that was also, there's too much for today's video that is already pretty long by itself. But there were other measures that were taken. For example, the destruction of the apocryphal books of Numa Pompilius. Rome came to ban philosophers as these, moral corruptors, especially the Pythagoreans. As we've seen, there were, the Romans kind of liked Epicureanism, Stoicism in particular, but the Pythagoreans, as we've seen, were basically a Dionysian sect, right? It was kind of bringing all under literally the earth, as Pythagoras himself, and even though there was some kind of celestial element to it, it was definitely subordinated to the ultra, the Tectonic one. And so we cannot see in these actions that sometimes we've seen also the destruction of foreign cities, etc. Just, they were doing it because it's just politics, man. It's contingent to the situation. Not quite. right? It's not a coincidence. There was a deeper reason for which the Romans would agree that was the right thing to do. And so this was all an offshoot of a Demetrian civilization that the Romans also worked to kind of purify of its more negative elements, right? As we've seen, the female figures remain prominently in Roman civilization, but they were kind of dried of their kind of more sentimental or, mystical dimension that were seen as, the true Roman virtues they would expect from a patrician woman. And everything is thus easily explained. And there is towards the golden age of Augustus, that was a purely religious, as anything ancient really, a purely religious renewal and radical reform, and coming back to the golden age itself. You can see this reaffirmation after a further struggle that at that point had taken literally an imperial dimension, right? Think about the Roman conquest of kingdoms that have been overrun, let's say, by the kind of ISIS-like centers like Egypt or Jerusalem, and that were bringing forward another principle compared to the Roman one. So when we look at the Roman Civil War, we can, in a sense, also observe this kind of think about the democratic ideal that was declining in different ways during the civil wars, right? It was always kind of an oligarchic struggle, right? But somebody would side with the monarchic side, others would kind of more the democratic. There was some kind of meaning like that. Pompeius, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, this could be seen in a sense as the ones that sided more with the anti-traditional side, not radically, not intrinsically or essentially, but still, favoring a passage that was at least basing itself on of an anti-traditional view, or at least when it seemed traditional, like in the sense of the defense of the Republic. This was concealing, let's say, as we've seen in the Fortuna Caesaris video, kind of the recognition of a superior principle that was advancing to restore actually an order that had been broken at that point in, as you know, in the mechanisms of the Republic. Cleopatra herself in the Ptolemaic kingdom was a symbol of an aphrodisiac civilization. The Ptolemies had been among the Diadochi, the ones that had syncretized the most, right, and compromised the most with the local, Tectonic cults, right, and these masses that were habituated to kind of be brought under the solar principle, but still without this kind of warlike ethos that could still find in the barbarian tribal West, let's say. And Antony kind of fell prey, as you know, of Cleopatra, of this model. Think about the hierogamic symbolism of Cleopatra and Antony as Aphrodite and Dionysus, that were a purely Tectonic connection at that point. So no sign of solar symbolism in it, a totally Hellenizing model without an ostensible reconnection to the solar one, in spite of the fact that even Egypt had that as in the arsenal. Caesar didn't quite do this. Caesar came mostly as a conqueror, so he mostly embodies the Romulus and his Kellers with the Sabine women. So a Uranic principle that conquers, subdues, and ingravitates the Tectonic one. quite literally meant. And so that could happen because it was the Roman eagle essentially praying its reward properly, as Egypt is one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean. And what Caesar thought of himself is quite famously written by Suetonius, that makes Caesar speaking at the funeral of his own, saying, the Gens Julian can claim both the sanctity of kings, who reign supreme among mortals, and the reverence due to gods, who hold even kings in their power. So if you wonder what Caesar was thinking of himself, that's kind of the model. So you see the divine principle there that comes back, right, and is that Caesar foretold in this reemergence of the highest view of the imperium in Rome. And so Caesar, you know that Caesar's destiny was quite functional to the restoration of the order that, however, had to be carried out by Augustus, right? Caesar was a kind of a metaphysically external figure that had to restore the republic, but while, or at least what they thought, of course, the republic was, which was mostly based on such civitas and the virtus and the imperial prerogative that this entailed. So Augustus actually takes that next step of fulfilling the duty that Caesar, it was something superior in that model and unreachable, had served him, right? So Augustus was, in the eyes of the Romans, a numen embodied, right? So that expression of pure light, celestial and military power. Augustus, in the Pax Romana, had to repristinate the aeternitas of the res publica. So setting again the basis for that sacral force to rule the world uncontrasted. For this reason, Augustus took on the symbol of Apollo, of the northern light. And this reestablished, in a sense, the order of the ancient Roman religion against any invasion of external influences of non-Uranic type, but also of the so-called superstitiones, right? So that were somewhat the same thing. I mean, the term superstition in this sense, what does it mean in etymologically, even in our language? It means, it comes from superstitio, which literally means to stay above, right? So it's like before the Etruscan gods, we were saying the Etruscans had celestial gods, but they thought there was somebody above them. There was actually Tectonic in nature. So the idea, the principle of superstitio, that was actually a cultus illicitus. So it's as if, it was heresy. And that's why the Romans forbade that, and you couldn't actually profess any kind of cult you wanted in the Roman Empire, right? Just, the licit ones. That, in this sense, the Romans exercised, a bit of tolerance, true, but properly, those cults that were so viciously stressing the lack, right, of individual responsibility and of that kind of moral superiority for which there was something always above you that you would depend on, and not you kind of being worth of what, of the gods per se, and the gods that rule the world, was incompatible to that system, right? So Augustus embodied that kind of absolute celestial power that reflected the perfection of the universe, and therefore it was displayed by the ecumenic rule of Rome at that point of the end of civil wars, the civil strife for recomposition. Augustus was the one that technically had restored the order, because they invented it in order to explain what had happened, that somebody had dared to to infringe the order. It had been a terrible sin of the Roman people that had to be restored. And it was done, Augustus says, per auspicis meis, that is to say, he was acting as a medium with the gods because he was the highest medium, right? The worthiest of them. And so the perfect imperator, and he whose soul could eventually elevate at the side of the gods themselves to restore that order, for which the Roman people, that was the chosen one, could have not incurred if not in the evidence of a terrible sacrilege, because the destiny of Rome was to rule the world. So there was no other way out, right? And so at that point, Rome posed itself in a pragmatic relation, of course, with the beliefs of other peoples that were tolerated, as long as fundamentally Rome provided providing a protection on them. Also let them a degree of autonomy, as mostly this was recognized, right? There was not such a thing like properly a Roman state as we intend in contemporary idea, in spite of our republican and democratic ideas about the classical world. They were a complete fabrication of modern times. Was actually a lordship, was properly an imperium on other peoples that had been granted by Jupiter, and that allowed the Romans to keep an eye on things, and when something went wrong, that they would intervene. But the fact there was a Roman Empire embodied the fact that whoever stayed under Roman domination was implicitly subjugated.